warning. I've been told by the translators, slow down. Yes. Well, now we come to the New Testament. The New Testament. Page 1, paragraph 1. The good news according to Matthew. I'll read the great mission text, the first paragraph of the New Testament. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Now, I probably didn't need to read that because you probably have it memorized. It is, after all, the opening paragraph of the New Testament. The early church didn't give any thought at all to Christmas. They never mentioned it. Nobody stood up in the book of Acts and said, "Why don't you go down to Bethlehem and check the innkeeper? Ask the shepherds what happened on Christmas night." Nobody did that. In the first years of the early church, they were so taken with the resurrection of Jesus, the empty tomb, the ascended Christ, the Lord in heaven, that they forgot about Christmas. And then, according to the scholars, and I agree with them, Gnosticism came along and said, we love this Christ in the heavens. We can live with that. And sometime later, Matthew and Luke said, oh gee, we've been forgetting something in the message. And Matthew and Luke reached back and produced what the church was perilously close to forgetting, the message we call Christmas. You know that Luke, in the first 2 chapters, drives Jesus all the way back to Adam and recapitulates the life of Jesus as a child of the human race and the savior of the human race. And Luke does that because Luke is a Gentile, and Luke is a Roman citizen, and Luke is thinking about the bigger picture. Matthew, of course, drives Jesus all the way back to the beginning of Israel, because Matthew is inclined and desirous to show that this Jesus who now is in heaven is also the firstborn Savior of the Jews. And so we have 2 infancy narratives. I wish there were time to work with Luke. Luke puts all of his theology in the 6 choir songs of the first 2 chapters. It's very interesting when you go to an opera, you often hear the orchestra play the overture. I suppose you know this, but the overture is probably the last piece of music to be written, right, Jim? And the purpose of the overture is to include the themes that will be appearing later in the opera or the operetta. Some of you have heard that, and you see these tunes coming up, and then later on, you see them in the tapestry of that work that may last for a couple hours. Matthew and Luke's infancy narratives might well, according to Raymond Brown and other biblical scholars, have been written last. As a matter of fact, I think they were. As a matter of fact, I think that Matthew and Luke wrote these infancy narratives in the light of the fact that they wanted the themes that appear here to be an introduction to the message and the method and the mission of Jesus. worldwide. And so I want to talk about Matthew's Christmas message and world mission from the first 2 chapters of Matthew. 5 vignettes. The first is Matthew's cemetery tour. Now, nothing could be further from the resurrection message than a cemetery tour. And I suppose you've wondered, at least I did, for years. The good news, according to Matthew, and then you have a list of dead people. What is happening? And why is this the way we prelude the gospel in the opening page of the New Testament? And then if you analyze the tombstones in chapter 1, you realize that Matthew is taking us back to the oldest section first. And have you ever been in these old cemeteries where you have to sort of pull the weeds away from the tombstones? And when you pull the weeds away, the most amazing thing is there are 4 women listed with tombstones. For Matthew, these are the grandmothers of Christmas, the other women in the family of Jesus, or the skeletons in the closet. And it's about grace that they are included. Let me remind you who these women are. The first was Tamar. The Tamar story is in Genesis 38. Genesis 38 is a 20-year gap in the Joseph story. Joseph starts in 37, and Joseph is sold off into Egypt, and as it were, the camera swings back to show you what happened to the family that sold him. Primarily Judah, the oldest brother. Judah had 3 sons. Married Tamar and died. Now, in those days, marriage was not about love, it was about inheriting property. And so to secure the property rights in the promised land, it was called levirate marriage. The second son would be obligated to step up and marry the widow. Onan, however, the second son, realizing that the inheritance would go to the children of his brother and not to his family, decided not to do it. And the text is very clear. It's one of those R-rated texts in the Bible. He refused to consummate the marriage sexually, so he died. Now, Judah had 1 son left. I have 3 sons. I think I know a little bit about how he might feel. My daughter-in-law has devoured 2 of my sons. I think what I better do is send her back to her own village and say, thank you very much, but get out of my life. You have done nothing for me except devour my kids. My inheritance is gone in the promised land. And so he sends her away. And if you read the story in Genesis 38, she disappears for some time. But finally she takes initiative, as many women in the Bible do. And she said, I've had enough of this injustice. He broke the law. And so she dressed as a prostitute, sat beside the road, and sure enough, her father-in-law came along and decided to have a quick trick with her. Only problem was he forgot his credit card. Never leave home without it. He didn't have any money to pay her. So when it was over, he said, tell you what, I'll pay later. Why don't you just take my signature ring, which is the credit card in the ancient world. Now, a few weeks later or months later, the word came back to Judah's house, your daughter-in-law is pregnant. And all the male chauvinism in him rose up and he said, kill her! Let her be executed. On the way to the execution, somebody asked, oh, who's the father? And she said, well, I'm not quite sure, but whoever it was gave me this credit card. Oh, gee. The result was twins who became ancestors of David and ancestors of Jesus. the grace of God. Tamar became a grandmother of Christmas, and hers is the first tombstone in Matthew 1. The second woman is Rahab. The story of Rahab is in Joshua chapter 2. Israel was wandering in the desert, and have you seen this marvelous cartoon? I have it. It's absolutely wonderful. Moses is out on the hill saying, "Follow me." And down in the caption, his wife is talking, and the caption says, "After 39 years of wandering in the wilderness, Mrs. Moses secretly asked for directions." One of those great biblical cartoons. Well, they were wandering out there for 40 years in a bad neighborhood, unemployed on food stamps called manna, and trying to get their act together to go into the promised land. And one of the things they did, according to Numbers 13, was send some spies ahead. And so the spies entered Jericho, which was a border town. Now, where do you hide from the Gestapo in a place like Jericho? Well, you go to the R-rated section of town where the lights are low, you can rent hotels by the hour, and nobody asks your name. And so the spies went to Rahab's place. It was infamous, by the wall. And we know something about Rahab's hotel because both Hebrews 11 and James chapter 2 talk about Rahab and use the word porne to describe her. Porne, obviously, is the root of our word for pornography, which tells you something about the hotel that she ran. Now, the two spies went there to get away and to hide in the city, and the Gestapo knocked on the door. Can you tell us where those spies went? Rahab lied. She said they went that way, sent them on a false trail. Then she pulled the spies out from their hiding and said, "You know, I've heard about you people. I've heard about how God delivered you from Pharaoh and preserved you in the desert. Can I be part of you?" And Hebrews 11 talks about her faith. It's pretty obvious her faith had to save her. Her works wouldn't have done it, right? And she married a man named Boaz, not the Boaz of the Ruth story, but another one. And she is the second tombstone in the trail of redemption that tells us what grace of God is and for whom grace is intended. The third character there is Ruth. Ruth is never said to be a sinner, but she comes from the culture of Sodom. You see, in the days of the Judges, and Ruth is a commentary on the book of Judges, it tells you how God is working silently and silently during the time when Israel's history is going in 7 cycles of evil, and concludes with this epitaph: "Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." It was a time of enormous sin, but God was working through that period silently to bring about the greatest king Israel would ever have. And the theme of Ruth is in the list of 10 names in the last verses of chapter 4, where you read that Obed will have a baby. Obed's baby will be called what? Jesse. And Jesse will grow up and have a baby, and Jesse's baby will be called what? David. Period, full stop, end of story. While you think Israel's history is going in circles, the writer of Ruth is telling us it's not. It only looks that way. Chapter 1 of Ruth looks circular because there's a famine in the house of bread, Bethlehem, and they go to Moab for salvation. Nothing could be more like the Judges than that. You see, where did Moab come from? Remember when Lot and his family fled? Genesis 18:19. Sodom. They moved to the suburbs, remember? And they moved into a suburban cave, and in another one of those R-rated texts, The daughters got the father drunk each night, and he got them pregnant each night. And the first of the babies born was Moab. Ruth is not called a sinner, but she is a Moabite. Her legacy is Sodom. That's the backdrop of the story. And so chapter 1 of Ruth is a circular chapter because because Naomi, whose name means pleasant, married Elimelech, which means God is my king, and they have 2 kids named Mahlon and Chilion, which in Hebrew means sick and failing. Probably vitamin B deficiency because there was a famine in the land. And they go off to Moab, a place of Sodom, legacy, and all the men in the story die. So God is my king dies, and Mahlon and Chilion die. And this is the closest thing we have to a biblical soap opera. As the world turns, the book opens. 3 women are crying out on the street, and Ruth is trying desperately to be controlling her emotions. Her mother-in-law is going this way, and her daughter is going this, her sister is going this way. She finally chooses to go with her mother-in-law, knowing probably that she could never be buried in the cemetery in Jerusalem or in Bethlehem. And they, 2 ladies during the time of the judges, make a trip that no 2 women should ever make. And they go back home. And when they are entering the city of Bethlehem days later, the women of the city come out and they see them coming and they say, could this be pleasant? Could this be Naomi? Is this? She looks old. She looks angry. And Naomi says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. It's a pun in Hebrew. For the Lord has marred me. And she's blaming God, and chapter 1 goes in a circle. Chapter 2 raises the historical question, do events like this happen by chance? The writer is very clever, and as Ruth gets up, her mother-in-law says, now it's the barley season, and you've got to go out and pick some grain. And the writer says she just happened to go. I love the King James there. Her hap was to go into the field of Boaz, who just happened to be there, and who just happened to be the most eligible bachelor in the town. Chapter 2 raises the question, do things not go in circles? That's chapter 1, but do things happen by chance? Chapter 3, after about 6 weeks of, and by the way, every day Ruth comes back, she's got ephods full of grain. It's pretty obvious that as a businessman, Boaz has lost it. He sends his crew out there ahead of her, throws extra grain in her row, and she comes home very naively with just buckets of the stuff, and her mother knows something's going on. Finally, in chapter 3, she sits her down and gives her a mother-daughter talk, and she gives her 3 instructions. First of all, Ruth, take a bath. It's about time. I'm not inventing this. It's in the text. Secondly, put on your best perfume. It's probably midnight in Moab or something like that. Third, put on a dress. All he's been seeing you is in your working stuff. And you don't smell all that good either. Okay? It's the end of the season. Now, and then she instructs him. And chapter 3 could be subtitled, How to Get a Husband. And it raises the historical question, do things happen by conspiracy? It really does. Because, she goes out there, she sits. Her mother-in-law says, now, on the hillsides, there's a threshing floor. They cut wheat all day, and they bring it to the threshing floor. But at 6 o'clock at night, when the heat goes up and the sun sets, the Jordan Valley, the heat rises because the Jordan Valley is like a wind tunnel. And the mountainside cool air comes down, and so what happens is you throw the grain up and the kernels fall to the ground, but the chaff blows over the side of the hill. But by the time they get their grain pile done, it's late. The grain exchange back in the town has closed. So because it's the time of the judges, and everybody's doing that which is right in their own eyes, they have to sleep by the grain pile or it'd be stolen before morning. Now she knows all this because she's a native. She grew up on the farm, and she's telling her daughter-in-law to go out there, sit downwind, no, upwind, and wait, and he's going to have a little wine and a little bread. He's going to lie down, and he's going to try to keep warm because it gets cold on the hillside at night. It's 3,000 feet elevation. And tell you what, you just sneak up there and uncover him, and he's going to sit up at 12 o'clock. He's going to wake up shivering, and he's going to see you and think it's an angel, and he's going to propose. How to Get a Husband, chapter 3. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. Act 1 is going into the city, to the gates, to get a marriage license. First of all, you have to announce that land is for sale. But the sticker is, if you buy the land, you have to pay for Ruth. Well, there's a kinsman who comes up and talks to his broker and decides he can't really deduct Ruth from his taxes, I suppose. So he lets her pass, and Boaz grabs the land and the bride. And the book ends with a baby shower, where the women of chapter 1 who've been angry are sitting around, passing around baby Obed. And they realize that this is Naomi's promise. And the book ends with a list of names. Baby Obed is the grandfather of the greatest king Israel will ever have. That's how God works. Is it circular? Is it tragedy? Is it accidents? Is it conspiracy? Oh yeah, God uses all those things. But God is moving toward a goal to deliver his people. And the last name is David. And Matthew 1 begins, Jesus, son of David. And so Ruth is included, the grandmother of Jesus. The fourth woman is Mrs. Uriah. Mrs. Uriah, you have to read 1 Samuel 11. We know her to be Bathsheba. She was the wife of David's best soldier. David was now the king. He was about 42 years old, in midlife crisis, clearly. Life had flattened out for David, a little bit like Pepsi without fizz, you know. Middle management was off at war over at Amman, Jordan, called Rehoboth in those days, and Philadelphia later. David, it had been a long time since he wrote a hymn or killed a giant, frankly. What do you do after so many years of being the great king and everybody's singing psalms to you? He went up on the roof and he saw a beautiful sight. The wife of his best soldier taking a bath. He got involved in an affair and started what we could call the Jerusalem Gate cover-up scheme in 3 parts. Because the word came back a few weeks later to the palace that she was pregnant. And he had to cover it up. So first of all, he wrote a letter to General Joab out on the front, 50 miles away across the Jordan Valley, fighting for him. He said, send Uriah back home. Give him a little R&R. It's time. See, he wanted him to go home so that people might think the baby's his. They didn't have DNA checks in those days. It didn't work. Uriah was such a good soldier, he said, how can I go home when my friends are out there giving their life for our great king? So David, plan 2, brought him to the palace and got him really drunk, hoping then he would go home. He didn't go. Plan 3 is unbelievable. He wrote out his execution, which basically said, fight all the way up to the wall, withdraw quickly. Now, you don't do that in the ancient world. You don't fight your way all up to the wall, because then all they have to do is drop rocks on your head and you're dead. And every good soldier would know that, but since David had commanded it, Joab did it, and he was killed. And of course, David could step up, embrace the widow, and everybody would applaud the national hero, our king. Except the prophet knew about it from God and said, you are the man. And David was crushed, he was exposed, and Psalm 51 is his confession. The baby was stillborn, but the next child was Solomon. These are the 4 women that I call the grandmothers of Christmas. All of them have rather R-rated stories and controversy surrounding them. For 2,000 years almost, there's been a history of this text. People have said, why these names? Because if you compare this genealogy with Exodus 6 or the genealogies in 1 Chronicles, they don't include these names. Matthew clearly is making a theological statement to include them. What is he saying? The first sermon I found in the history of the church is in the 4th century on this text. Jerome's idea was, these women are included because they are all sinners. Contrast Mary, the Virgin Mother. It's about grace. Mary and Jesus came into the world to save sinners like this. I'd say, right, Jerome, except all the men in the text are sinners too. There must be more to it. The most interesting sermon I have found in the history of the church on this text is Martin Luther's. Martin Luther seems to have been the first person in history to observe that all 4 women were foreigners. That 2 were Canaanites, Tamar and Rahab, from the cursed race of Canaan, from Genesis 9. And that Ruth was a Moabite. And Moabite's origin was Sodom. And Mrs. Uriah, unnamed perhaps in deference to the king in Matthew 1, we know to be Bathsheba, was doubtless Hittite. Said Luther, it's really about missions. Chapter 28 says, go into all the world, preach the gospel, disciple the nations, but this list of names tells you who was meant at that time when they said nations. The ethne, the tribes, Canaanites, Moabites, Hittites, and Jews. Raymond Brown has looked at this text and said, well, I think something else is going on here. I think Matthew's doing a little pastoral care for Mary. And he searched the whole Old Testament and found all the scandalous birth stories and strange marriages, brought them all together and said, Mary, I know you're having trouble explaining where your kid came from. You're not alone. Here's your support group. I can't prove or disprove that that's the case. Edward Schweitzer of Zurich is a great Baptist Bible teacher. And in his scholarly work, he has another explanation. Edward Schweitzer says that after the disciples scattered, when Jesus had gone back after Pentecost, we know that Matthew went off the map of Israel to Damascus, but then he ended up in Antioch. He ended up in Gentile territory. As a pastor, one of the issues for him was, what happens if you don't live in the Palestine area? What happens if you don't live in the Holy Land? Can we too be saved? And as one of the ways Matthew was doing pastoral care for his congregation, he said to them, not only does the fruit of Jesus' life and work go to the ends of the age, but even the roots of Jesus go beyond the boundaries of Palestine. And dear friend, Jesus choreographed into his own bloodline all of the scandalous racial groups in the Middle East. And here for Matthew is where Christmas joins Easter. You see, a cemetery tour takes on new significance now. Because if you compare the genealogies, Jesus comes from Mary, and Joseph is the husband of Mary, but not the father of Jesus, according to Matthew, according to Luke. But in this genealogy, and by comparing others, we find something very interesting. And that is that Matthew, or rather Joseph and Mary, have the same ancestors up through David. And then the line splits. So that all 4 women are not only the grandmothers of Mary, they're the grandmothers of Joseph. And so I say to you, this list of names smashes racism in every form. Because what it says is that Jesus came into the world to claim his own. It tells us who his own are. Remember? Canaanites, Moabites, Hittites, and Jews. And what it says is that Jesus chose his own earthly bloodline very carefully and choreographed into his own body the bloodlines of people that the Jews were rejecting in their own family. And so I say to you, it's about mission, you know. Jesus not only shed his blood for the world, he got that blood from the world. The blood of the Canaanite, Moabite, Hittite, and Jew was shed on the cross for the sins of the world. And my Savior was mestizo. He was the mixed racial Savior of the world. It is not enough in Matthew's Christmas story to focus on the mother of Jesus. We need the mission focus of the grandmothers of Jesus. Let the skeletons come out of the closet because it defines the mission. That's the first vignette. That's the response to those who preach only about Easter. First response is, let's take a fresh look at our cemetery and find the hope there. The second vignette, Matthew reminds us, is that Jesus was, after all, virgin born. I know some people are uncomfortable with that. I'm not. I think Karl Barth was absolutely right about this. The human race could never produce its own salvation. Christianity is not a bootstrap theology. The difference fundamentally between the Christian faith and other faiths is not that one's better than the other, as practiced by believers. The difference is that other faiths are our best attempts to reach out to God. And Christianity fundamentally is God's best attempt to reach us. And so the virgin birth reminds us that even as Christ had a glorious exit from the human race, he had a glorious entrance. And it's bookends on Jesus. As Karl Barth reminds us, the virgin birth reminds us that grace is always an outside gift. And Matthew wants us to see that, humanly speaking, cemeteries are growing. That's the product of the human race. Expanding cemeteries. Matthew 1. The virgin birth is a clue that something else is going to happen. That's vignette number 2. And it made all the creeds because all the early Christians understood the significance that our help had to come from outside. We could not produce our own salvation. We were rescued. The virgin birth is the sign of that, and it's in all the creeds. There's never been doubt about that. The third vignette is those international visitors who came to visit the new baby. Now, it's very interesting here that Luke, the Gentile, the international person, is the one who tells us that the first visitors were local shepherds. But it is Matthew, the Jew, who's telling us that at least among those first visitors were international scholars from the place we now call Iraq. And here's Matthew's irony. You see, the Old Testament is the story of how Babylon conquered Jerusalem and took the best sons and daughters away. Thousands of them were marched 900 miles back down to Babylon where they lived, and most didn't come back. And so when the Old Testament ends, we've got this scar on the history. The Iraqis are the armies that have come against Jerusalem, both versions, both the Assyrians of the north and then the Babylonians of the south. Those are the bad guys. And so in the Old Testament, as it ends, there's no good news from there. But Matthew wants you to know something. That Daniel and his friends were not refugees, they were missionaries. And Daniel went and served in the palace and did what Jeremiah 29 says you should do. Seek the shalom of the city where I sent you. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, and in its shalom you'll find your own shalom. And so Daniel served his entire career in the Babylonian government. He mastered the astrology and astronomy of that empire and left an interpretive record of the significance of the stars, so that 5 centuries later, the scholars looking at the star and Daniel's commentary on its significance came 900 miles not to conquer, but to worship the King of the Jews. Matthew wants us to understand the significance of Israel's diaspora in a very different way than Israel understood it. And so the Iraqis, those terrible people of the Old Testament, are the first ones for Matthew to come back with gifts instead of guns and swords. Gifts to give to the baby as an act of worship. You see, for Matthew, the history is about mission. The gospel is international. The Christmas story is global. The fourth story, the fourth vignette, is the waking of Joseph and the flight to Egypt. And Pontius was not the pilot of the flight. Now I'm so glad that the gifts did not include Pampers, but gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which could be convertible to hard currency for the journey to Egypt. My dear friends, Matthew wants you to know that the Christmas story is about an Asian-born Jesus who became an African refugee. The Christmas story is about an intercontinental migrant named Jesus who was born in a borrowed barn, lived in Africa, and came back to be buried in a borrowed grave, but who rose from the dead and is now the triumphal Savior of the world. You see, we don't tell the Christmas story like this very much. We've wrapped it in middle-class tinsel. We've defanged the story. We've taken out its mission significance. Matthew's putting it back in here. He's reminding us that Jesus is a West Asian-born baby who became an African refugee. Do you know that over half of the babies born in the world this day, 100 every 7 seconds, will be born in Asia? Over half of the world's babies are born in Asia, and Jesus was an Asian-born baby. And do you know that over half of the world's 30 million refugees are Africans going from country to country to find bread? And Jesus was a refugee in Africa. You see, Matthew wants us to know that our Jesus understands this stuff that people are experiencing. But that isn't the end. There's a fifth vignette. It's what happened in Bethlehem. The killing of the babies. This is the climax of Matthew's Christmas. The killing of Jesus' baby peers. Can you believe it? I wonder how old he was when he was first told that all the babies of Bethlehem died for him before he could die for them on the cross. Because they did, you know. They did. In my city, Chicago, last year, 46% of the babies that lived to be born in one of our hospitals were either crack addicted, fetal alcohol addicted, or HIV addicted at birth. Nearly half of the children that are born in some of our inner cities are damaged kids. We're producing a harvest of broken and damaged children worldwide. If there is anybody on earth or in heaven that would understand the pain of that, it would be our Savior Jesus, for whom a village full of baby boys died on his behalf for the sins of an adult before he could die for them on the cross. And that, for Matthew, is part of the Christmas story. And Matthew takes us out on the road outside Bethlehem. And we see Rachel, the mother of Israel, weeping. Rachel is weeping for her lost children. And Bethlehem is just the latest. And Matthew is saying to us, "Oh, dear Rachel, the children are gone. They've gone off to Babylon. But dear Rachel, some of them will come back to worship. Oh, Rachel, they've gone off to Egypt. And most will die, but one will return to be a child in Nazareth. And oh, Rachel, he too will die. And Mary, the other mother of Christmas, will join you and weep for a lost child. But Rachel, it won't be easy. There will be holocausts and gas ovens. But Rachel, one grave is open. One grave is empty." Matthew wants the Jews to know that. Even as he says, "Go ye therefore in all the world and tell all the tribes, all the peoples, and disciple the nations." One grave is empty. The Christmas story and the Easter story combined for Matthew. That's why I call it Matthew's Christmas and World Mission. To God be the glory, to the earth be peace, to the Baptists be courage, and to the world be hope. God bless you.